It was upon a bitter November evening in the year 1893 that I found myself once more in that singular company of circumstances which so often surrounded my old friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The hour was approaching 11, and a cold rain had been beating against the windows of our rooms at Baker Street with such persistence that even the gas lamps of the street below seemed blurred into pale yellow smudges. Holmes had spent the greater part of the evening in his armchair, his long, angular figure sunk beneath the familiar dressing gown, while his fingers moved restlessly over the stem of his violin. He had played little, however. Instead, he had stared into the fire with that intense stillness which, from long experience, I knew to be the outward sign of some problem upon which his extraordinary mind was engaged. I had just placed my medical journal upon the table when there came 3 sharp knocks upon our door. Holmes raised his head. "Watson," said he, "that is no ordinary visitor." I smiled. "You have heard the footsteps already?" "No." "Then how?" "The interval between the knocks. The first 2 were made with the knuckles, the third with the side of the hand." A man accustomed to command, impatient by nature, and unfamiliar with domestic doors. Moreover, he has paused twice upon the landing. "You can hear that?" "I can hear the floorboards." Before I could answer, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the doorway. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it is a matter of the greatest urgency. Show him in." A moment later, the door opened, and a tall man entered. He was perhaps 45 years of age, broad-shouldered, elegantly dressed, and possessed of the pale, strained countenance of one who had traveled far under unpleasant circumstances. His black traveling coat was damp from the rain, and a narrow streak of mud marked the lower edge of his trousers. In his right hand he carried a small leather valise. He looked first at Holmes and then at me. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "My name, sir. I have been advised that you are the only man in London who might possibly help me." Holmes gestured toward the chair. "Then you have been advised correctly in one respect and prematurely in another. Pray sit down." The stranger obeyed, though his eyes remained fixed upon the door. Holmes noticed it. "So," said he quietly, "you are not merely afraid, you expect someone to follow you." The man's face tightened. "I expected someone to be waiting outside. Were you disappointed?" "I do not know." Holmes leaned forward. "Excellent. Uncertainty is generally more informative than fear. Now, sir, your name?" The visitor hesitated. "Sir Reginald Ashcombe." I confess that the name was familiar to me. Sir Reginald was a distinguished financier whose affairs had been frequently mentioned in the newspapers. He possessed interests in several railway companies and was said to have considerable influence in commercial circles. Holmes gave no sign of recognition. "What brings Sir Reginald Ashcombe to Baker Street at this hour?" The man placed his leather valise upon the floor. "An event occurred tonight aboard the 12:15 express from Manchester." Holmes's expression sharpened. "The Midnight Express? The Western Northern Express?" "Indeed." Sir Reginald swallowed. "A man was found dead in a locked railway compartment." I rose slightly from my chair. Holmes did not move. How long had he been dead? "Perhaps 20 minutes when the train reached Euston." "Who discovered the body?" "The guard." "Cause of death?" "I was told it was a gunshot." "And yet you do not appear to be here because a man has been murdered." Sir Reginald stared at him. "No." "Then why?" The silence which followed was broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. At last Sir Reginald said, "Because the dead man had my name in his pocket." Holmes's eyebrows lifted. "Your name?" "Yes." "In what form?" "A card." "Your calling card?" "No." Sir Reginald reached slowly into his coat. For a moment his fingers trembled. He withdrew a small white rectangle of stiff paper and placed it upon Holmes's palm. I leaned forward. There were only 3 words upon it, written in black ink. Sir Reginald Ashcombe. Beneath the name was a single number, 17. Holmes studied the card beneath the gaslight. He turned it over. Nothing. He held it toward the flame. Nothing. He brought it close to his nose. "Interesting." "What is interesting?" I asked. Holmes ignored me. "Sir Reginald, where did you receive this?" "I did not." "Who did?" "The dead man." Holmes looked up. "Then we have begun with a contradiction." "I know." "Good. Contradictions are often more valuable than evidence." Sir Reginald leaned forward. "The dead man was traveling under an assumed name." At least, that is what the railway officials believe. His ticket was purchased in Liverpool. He occupied a first-class compartment reserved under the name of Mr. Charles Bellamy. Did you know Charles Bellamy? No. Did you know the dead man? Sir Reginald hesitated. That is the question I came here to answer. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You believe you have seen him before? Yes. Where? On the train. Before the murder? Yes. Holmes sat back. Then tell me precisely what happened. Sir Reginald drew a breath. I boarded the express at Manchester at 9:45. I had been attending a meeting there. I intended to travel directly to London. Alone? Yes. Which carriage? First class. Compartment 17. Holmes's fingers stopped moving. 17. Sir Reginald nodded. The room seemed suddenly colder. You occupied compartment 17? Yes. And the dead man? Compartment 17. I looked from one man to the other. That is impossible. Sir Reginald turned toward me. Exactly, Doctor. Holmes smiled faintly. No, Watson. Note impossible. He rose and crossed to the mantel. Merely inconvenient. He took down his pipe. Continue, Sir Reginald. The financier stared at him. I boarded the train and entered my compartment. I had barely removed my coat when a conductor appeared and informed me that there had been a clerical error. What error? My reservation had been duplicated. Were you moved? Yes. To which compartment? Number 19. Holmes paused. And who occupied 17? I was told that the other passenger had already entered. Did you see him? Yes. When? About 10 minutes later. And what did you observe? Sir Reginald's expression darkened. He was standing in the corridor. Description? Tall, thin, dark hair, grey overcoat. He appeared to be watching me. Did he speak? No. Did you speak to him? No. Then why are you certain he was watching you? Because when I turned away, I saw his reflection in the window. Holmes's face became thoughtful. Very good. Sir Reginald continued. The train left Manchester. For nearly an hour nothing happened. Then, somewhere between Crewe and Stafford, I heard a noise. A shot? No. What kind of noise? A knock. Holmes glanced at me. A knock? 3 knocks. From where? From compartment 17. I felt a chill run through me. Sir Reginald's voice dropped. I went into the corridor. The door to 17 was closed. Locked? Yes. Did you open it? No. Why not? Because someone spoke from inside. What did he say? Sir Reginald looked toward the fire. He said my name. Holmes's eyes flashed. Precisely what words? The financier swallowed. Sir Reginald Ashcombe, you should never have boarded this train. For several seconds none of us spoke. Holmes's expression was unreadable. And then I stepped backward. Why? Because I recognized the voice. Whose? Sir Reginald looked at Holmes. The voice of a man who had been dead for 6 months. I confess that even after all my years beside Holmes, I felt the hairs upon the back of my neck rise. Holmes, however, merely lit his pipe. Now, said he, we approach the interesting part. Mr. Holmes, I swear to you, I have not accused you of lying. But you think I am mistaken. I think, Sir Reginald, that you have told me exactly what you believe occurred. That is not necessarily the same thing as what occurred. The financier looked wounded. Holmes continued. Tell me about the dead man. His name was Professor Adrian Vale. Holmes's pipe stopped halfway to his lips. Professor Vale? Yes. You knew him? I knew of him. Did he work for the railway? No. He was an engineer and an inventor. He had been investigating a new form of signaling system. Holmes turned toward me. Watson, do you recall the newspaper reports concerning the Ashcombe Railway Consortium? I remember something about a dispute over a signaling patent. Precisely. Sir Reginald rose suddenly. That dispute has nothing to do with this. Holmes looked at him. Then you have just told me that it does. The financier went pale. Holmes's voice remained calm. You came here because a dead man was found carrying your name. You have informed me that the dead man had threatened you through a locked door. You have further informed me that you recognized his voice as belonging to a man whom you believed dead. And now, when I mention a railway dispute connected with your own business interests, you become agitated. Sir Reginald stared at him. You have known about this? I know very little. Holmes tapped the card with his finger. But I know enough to understand that the number 17 is not a coincidence. What does it mean? That, said Holmes, is what we shall discover. A sudden sound came from the street below. A carriage. It stopped directly before our house. Sir Reginald turned toward the window. Holmes did not. Do not look, he said. The financier froze. How did you? Because the carriage has not stopped for our house. Holmes walked to the window and drew the curtain aside by half an inch. I joined him. A black private carriage stood beneath the gas lamp. Its driver sat motionless. No passenger emerged. Holmes watched for several seconds. Then he smiled. Watson. Yes? I believe our friend has been followed after all. Sir Reginald's face had become ashen. Then they know I am here. Possibly. What are we to do? Holmes released the curtain. Nothing. Nothing? Not yet. He returned to his chair and picked up the card once more. Whoever sent this message wishes us to believe that the murder aboard the Western Northern Express was committed for one reason. And what reason is that? I asked. Holmes looked into the fire. Revenge. He turned the card over. There, upon the reverse side, so faint that it might easily have been overlooked, was a small brown mark. Holmes rubbed it gently between his fingers. Then he smelled his fingertips. His expression changed. What is it? I asked. Holmes did not answer. Sir Reginald stared at him. What have you found? Holmes slowly folded the card and placed it inside his pocket. Something which makes the murder aboard that train considerably more dangerous than you suppose. He looked toward the rain-streaked window. And, Watson, I fear we have not been summoned to investigate the murder. Then why have we been summoned? Holmes's eyes met mine. To determine who the murderer intends to kill next. And with those words, the fire gave a sudden crack, the carriage below began to move, and somewhere in the darkness beyond Baker Street, a whistle sounded 3 long mournful notes. The following morning broke with a grey and cheerless aspect, and a thin mist lay over London as though the city itself had been wrapped in some enormous shroud. I had scarcely finished my breakfast when Holmes entered the sitting-room, fully dressed, his dark travelling coat buttoned to the throat, and his familiar travelling case in his hand. There was an alertness in his manner which told me that the night had brought him little sleep. You are coming with me, Watson. Where? Euston Station. To examine the compartment? To examine what remains of it. I glanced at him over the edge of my newspaper. You have already formed a theory? My dear Watson, I have formed 6. And which is correct? 5 are wrong. He took his hat from the table. That is the advantage of having theories early. One can discard them before they become convictions. We descended into the street a few minutes later. The fog had thickened, and the familiar sounds of London were softened into distant murmurs. A hansom carried us northward, its wheels splashing through the wet streets, while Holmes remained silent, staring through the window with that peculiar inward concentration which I had come to know so well. At last I broke the silence. You never told me what you discovered upon that card. I told you what I discovered. You said you had found something. Quite so. And then you put it in your pocket. Holmes smiled. Watson, there are occasions when the premature communication of a fact does more harm than ignorance. That sounds suspiciously like an excuse for keeping me in the dark. It is an excuse for keeping you useful. I laughed. You are becoming intolerable. My dear fellow, I have been intolerable for years. The cab drew up before Euston Station. The great terminus was alive with its usual morning confusion. Porters hurried between the platforms. Railway officials shouted instructions. Travelers struggled with trunks and parcels, and the hiss of steam drifted beneath the iron roof. Yet there was a peculiar restraint around one section of the platform. 2 constables stood near a first-class carriage, while a broad-faced man in railway uniform spoke anxiously with a gentleman whose severe expression marked him as an officer of Scotland Yard. The latter turned as we approached. Holmes, it was Inspector Lestrade. He came toward us with an expression that was almost one of relief. I wondered when you would arrive. I was informed that you required assistance. I require an explanation. That is generally why you require me. Lestrade gave me a sour glance. I hope you will be more useful today than you were amusing. Holmes smiled. You wound me, Lestrade. The inspector turned toward the carriage. The compartment is exactly as we found it. Who has entered? Only myself, the railway superintendent, 2 constables, and the medical examiner. Anyone else? No. Good. Holmes approached the door. Before entering, he stopped. Watson, yes? Do not touch anything. I had no intention of doing so. I know. But you have an unfortunate habit of touching precisely the object I am examining. I have saved your life more than once by touching things. True, you have also nearly destroyed several investigations by doing so. Lestrade sighed. Are you two going to argue all morning? No, said Holmes. Watson will. I followed him into the compartment. The first impression was one of remarkable ordinariness. It was a luxurious first-class compartment of the sort reserved for wealthy travelers. The leather seats were dark and polished. The brass fittings gleamed beneath the dim morning light, and a small table stood between the windows. On the floor lay a traveling rug, slightly crumpled, while beside the far seat rested a leather valise. The dead man had been removed. A faint reddish-brown stain remained upon the upholstery. Holmes stood in the center of the compartment without speaking. His eyes moved slowly from the ceiling to the floor, then to the window, then to the door. Lestrade folded his arms. Well? Holmes did not answer. He walked toward the table. Who occupied this compartment? The dead man, Professor Adrian Vale. Alone? So far as we know. Ticket? Found in his coat. Name? Charles Bellamy. Holmes glanced at him. The same name given to me last night. Yes. Interesting. He examined the table. There was a silver pocket watch upon it. Was this found here? Yes. Who moved it? No one. Holmes took a magnifying glass from his pocket and bent over the watch. Stopped at what time? 10 minutes past 11. Was it damaged? No. Then it stopped naturally. Lestrade frowned. Is that important? It may be. Holmes opened the watch. Inside the case was a tiny inscription. He read it silently. What does it say? I asked. He closed the watch. Nothing of importance. Lestrade snorted. You always say that when it is important. Holmes ignored him. He turned toward the window. Was this window opened? No. Locked? Yes. Holmes examined the latch. Then he crouched beside the lower frame. There is mud here. Lestrade stepped forward. From the victim's shoes? No. Holmes pointed to a tiny smear near the edge of the wooden frame, too high. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully touched the mark. He examined it. Clay? Clay? I asked. Yes. What is unusual about that? The railway line outside is surrounded by gravel and ballast. This particular clay is not common along the route. Lestrade looked impatient. Holmes, we have inspected the line. I know, and there was no evidence of anyone entering or leaving the train. I know that too. Then how could clay have entered this compartment? Holmes stood. That is precisely the question. He moved toward the door. Open it. Lestrade did so. Holmes inspected the corridor. Then he examined the door frame. He lowered himself until his face was nearly level with the floor. What do you see? I asked. A scratch. Where? Here. I crouched beside him. Near the threshold was a thin, curved line in the wood. Holmes ran his finger beside it without touching the mark. Something metallic was dragged across this. Could it have been a suitcase? No. How can you know? Because a suitcase would have produced a series of marks. He pointed toward the compartment. This is singular. Lestrade shook his head. You're making too much of a scratch. Possibly. Holmes straightened. That is why we examine everything. He returned to the seat where the body had been discovered. Describe the position. Lestrade took out his notebook. The victim was seated here, leaning backward. Gunshot wound to the chest. Revolver found on the floor. Which hand? Right. Was the revolver fired? Yes. Any fingerprints? None. Holmes looked at him. None? None worth mentioning. Then someone wiped it. That was my conclusion. No. Lestrade frowned. Why not? Because if someone had wiped the revolver, there would likely have been traces upon the cloth or nearby surfaces. Then what do you suggest? Holmes smiled faintly. I suggest nothing. He walked to the opposite seat. There is a more interesting question. What? Where is the bullet? Lestrade hesitated. In the body. No. The inspector looked annoyed. The medical examiner recovered it. Then where is it? In his possession. Bring him here. A few minutes later, a stout medical man entered the compartment carrying a small evidence envelope. Holmes examined it. May I? The doctor handed it over. Holmes held the envelope to the light. Interesting. What now? Lestrade demanded. Holmes turned to me. Watson, what would you say caused the discoloration on the bullet? I examined it. It appears darkened. Precisely. Powder residue? Perhaps. He handed it back. Or something else. Lestrade folded his arms. Can you tell us what? Not yet. He returned to the table. There was a small glass tumbler beside the seat. Holmes lifted it carefully. Was this found here? Yes. Water? Yes. He sniffed it. Empty? Almost. Holmes held it toward the light. There is residue. From whiskey? No. He passed it to the medical examiner. The man inspected it. I cannot identify it. Holmes smiled. Neither can I. Lestrade looked triumphant. So you admit you do not know? Of course. Then perhaps this case is not as simple as you thought. Holmes turned toward him. Lestrade, if you had spent half your life examining things you did not understand, you would have learned that ignorance is not the same as defeat. The inspector grunted. Holmes's attention suddenly shifted to the luggage. Open the valise. Lestrade did so. Inside were several shirts, a shaving kit, 2 books, a pair of gloves, and a packet of papers. Holmes examined each object methodically. One book was a technical volume on railway signaling. The other was a small leather-bound notebook. Holmes opened it. Most of the pages were filled with calculations, but 3 pages near the end had been torn away. Who removed these? Lestrade shook his head. We found it like this. Holmes turned several pages backward. The handwriting was precise and mathematical. Then he stopped. What is it? I leaned closer. At the bottom of one page was a sentence. The signal cannot be trusted when the light remains green. I read it twice. Odd. Very, said Holmes. Lestrade shrugged. Could be technical notes. No. Holmes's voice had become quiet. It is a warning. He closed the notebook. At that instant, a railway porter appeared at the door. Inspector, what is it? There is a gentleman asking to speak with Mr. Holmes. Holmes looked toward him. His name? The porter hesitated. He refused to give one. Then I am naturally interested. We followed the porter along the platform. At the far end stood a thin young man in a brown overcoat. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with a narrow face and anxious grey eyes. His hat was pulled low over his forehead. When he saw Holmes, he stepped forward. Mr. Holmes. Yes. My name is Edward Bellamy. Lestrade immediately stiffened. Bellamy? The young man looked at him. Yes. Holmes watched him closely. Are you related to Charles Bellamy? The young man went pale. He was my brother. The silence that followed was profound. Then, said Holmes quietly, you have come concerning the dead man. No. Bellamy shook his head. I have come concerning the man who killed him. Lestrade reached for his notebook. You know who the murderer is? I know who will be killed next. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Who? Bellamy looked around the station. Then he leaned closer. Sir Reginald Ashcombe. I felt a chill pass through me. Holmes remained perfectly still. When did you learn this? Last night. From whom? My brother. But your brother is dead. Bellamy swallowed. Yes. Then how could he have spoken to you? The young man's eyes filled with fear. He didn't speak to me. Then, Bellamy whispered. He sent me a message. Holmes's expression changed. What message? Bellamy slowly removed an envelope from his coat. It was sealed with black wax. Holmes took it. On the front were 4 words. For Sherlock Holmes only. Holmes looked at me, then at Lestrade. Finally, he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He read it once, then again. His face became grave. What does it say? I asked. Holmes folded the paper. It says, Watson, that we have been looking in the wrong direction. Lestrade stepped forward. Let me see it. Holmes handed him the paper. The inspector read it aloud. The man in compartment 17 was not murdered there. The murder occurred before the train ever left Manchester. Lestrade stared at Holmes. But the body was alive when the train departed. No, said Holmes. His eyes had become cold and brilliant. That is precisely the illusion. He looked back toward the distant train. The body was never alive when it entered that carriage. And at that moment, I understood for the first time why my friend had called the case dangerous. The murderer had not merely concealed a crime, he had constructed an entire journey around a corpse. For some moments after Holmes had spoken, neither Lestrade nor I could find an answer. The great station seemed suddenly to have fallen silent around us, although the ordinary tumult of Euston continued unabated. Porters pushed luggage across the platform, engines hissed beneath the iron roof, and the cries of railway officials rose and fell in the distance. Yet to my mind all these familiar sounds had become strangely unreal. Holmes stood with his hands behind his back, his eyes fixed upon the train. "You mean," said Lestrade at last, "that Professor Vale was already dead when the train left Manchester? That is what the message claims. But you believe it? I believe nothing merely because it is written on a piece of paper. Then why did you say—" "I said that the body was never alive when it entered that carriage. There is a difference between stating a conclusion and accepting evidence." Lestrade frowned. "You are playing with words. My dear Lestrade, words are frequently less dangerous than conclusions." He turned toward Edward Bellamy. "You said your brother sent you this message?" "Yes." "Where?" "At my lodgings." "When?" "Shortly before midnight." "Delivered by whom?" "I do not know." "You do not know?" "I was asleep. There was a knock at the door. When I opened it, no one was there." The envelope lay upon the floor. Holmes examined him closely. "Were you alone?" "Yes." "Did you hear footsteps?" "No." "Any carriage?" "No." "Was the envelope damp?" Bellamy hesitated. "Yes, from the rain." "I suppose so." "No," said Holmes quietly. "You suppose too much." Bellamy looked confused. Holmes handed the envelope back to him. "Feel the paper." The young man did so. "It is dry now." "Precisely. But you said—" "I said nothing about rain." Holmes took out his magnifying glass. "Observe the lower corner." I leaned nearer. There was a faint yellowish stain along the edge. "What is it?" I asked. "Clay." My heart quickened. The same substance Holmes had discovered inside compartment 17. Lestrade noticed it too. "Then the envelope came from the train." "Not necessarily." Holmes folded his arms. "But whoever handled it had recently been somewhere containing the same clay." "Where?" "That is what we must discover." Edward Bellamy suddenly seized Holmes by the sleeve. "Mr. Holmes, you must believe me. My brother knew something terrible. He told me 3 days ago that if anything happened to him, I was to find you." Holmes looked down at the hand upon his sleeve. Bellamy released him at once. "What did he know?" "I do not know." "That answer will not help your brother." Bellamy looked toward the train. "He was investigating the signaling system used by the Ashcombe Railway Consortium." "I know." "He believed someone was deliberately altering the signals." "Why?" "Because trains were being diverted." "To where?" "I don't know." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Your brother did not tell you?" "He said he had discovered a pattern." "What pattern?" Bellamy shook his head. "He said it involved the number 17. Holmes became very still. I saw the change immediately. The number had appeared on Sir Reginald Ashcombe's card, in Professor Vale's compartment, and now in connection with the signaling investigation. "What did 17 mean?" Holmes asked. "I don't know." "Think." "I have tried." "Did your brother mention a station?" "No." "A train?" "No." "A time?" Bellamy closed his eyes. Then suddenly he opened them. "There was one thing." "What?" He said, "When you see 17, look for what is missing." Holmes smiled. "That is considerably better." Lestrade looked irritated. "Better?" "The man is dead, and you're smiling." "I smile when a puzzle improves." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we shall return to the carriage." Lestrade objected. "You have already examined it." "Not properly." "What did you miss?" Holmes looked at him. "The absence." We returned to compartment 17. Holmes immediately began another examination. This time he moved with extraordinary patience. He inspected the seats, the luggage rack, the carpet, the door handle, the window frame, and even the brass screws securing the compartment's fittings. Lestrade watched in silence. After several minutes, Holmes removed his gloves. "Watson, tell me what you see." "A compartment." Precisely. And? Nothing else? I looked around. The luggage? Good. The glass? Good. The notebook? Good. The watch? Yes. And the rug? Holmes nodded. What is missing? I stared at him. I don't know. That is the difficulty. He pointed to the luggage rack. Professor Vale traveled for at least 2 days. His clothes are here, his books are here, his shaving equipment is here. Yes, yet there is no overcoat. I looked at the seat. Perhaps he wore it. No. Holmes pointed toward the wardrobe hook. There is a coat hook beside the door. If a man boarded a train in November, he would almost certainly remove his outer coat during a long journey. He might have kept it on. He might. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Was the victim wearing an overcoat when his body was discovered? No. Then where is it? Lestrade frowned. We assumed it was left at the station. Which station? Manchester. Did you verify that? No. Holmes smiled. Then we have our first missing object. He opened his notebook. Now we determine why it was removed. Lestrade looked doubtful. Perhaps the murderer simply took it. Why? I don't know. Then your theory is not superior to mine. Holmes walked toward the door. Come. We followed him to the railway superintendent's office. The superintendent, Mr. Harold Price, was a nervous man with silver spectacles and an elaborate mustache. He greeted Holmes with visible apprehension. I have already given my statement, sir. I do not require your statement. What do you require? Your staff records. Which records? All personnel assigned to the Western Northern Express departing Manchester last night. Price hesitated. That is confidential. Holmes leaned toward him. A man has been murdered on your train. Yes, and the corpse may have been placed there before departure. Price's face changed. What? You heard me. The superintendent sat down. I can give you the records. Within minutes, several documents were spread across the desk. Holmes examined them rapidly. Driver, fireman, guard, porters, ticket inspectors, cleaning staff. Then his finger stopped. Who cleaned compartment 17 before departure? Price consulted the sheet. Samuel Hargreaves. Where is he? He should be on duty. Find him. A porter was dispatched. 10 minutes later the man entered. He was short, muscular, and perhaps 50 years of age. His hands were heavily calloused, and there was a dark stain upon one sleeve. Holmes noticed it immediately. You cleaned compartment 17? Yes, sir. When? About 9:30. Before the train departed? Yes. Was anything unusual? No. Was the compartment empty? Yes. Completely empty? Hargreaves hesitated. Yes. Holmes stared at him. You are certain? Yes. Then why did you hesitate? The porter shifted uneasily. I remembered something. What? There was a coat. What kind? Grey. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Where was it? On the seat. Did you remove it? Yes. Why? I assumed the passenger had left it behind. Where did you put it? Hargreaves looked nervous. In the lost property room. Was it still there? I don't know. Holmes turned to Price. Send someone. A clerk hurried away. Hargreaves remained standing before Holmes. You said the compartment was empty. It was. Yet there was a coat. Yes. Anything else? Hargreaves shook his head. Holmes stepped closer. Think carefully. The man looked at him. There was a smell. What sort? Chemical. Lestrade leaned forward. Chemical? Yes, sir. What kind? I don't know. Holmes studied him. Did you notice blood? No. Did you notice water? No. Any powder? Hargreaves thought. White dust. Where? Near the carpet. Holmes's expression hardened. Why did you not mention this before? I didn't think it mattered. Where was the dust? Near the seat. Which seat? The one beside the window. Holmes looked at me. Watson, your medical opinion. I examined the man. White dust could be almost anything. Plaster, chalk, powder, dried chemical residue. Exactly. Holmes turned back to Hargreaves. Did you sweep it away? Yes. Where? Into the dustpan. And the dustpan? Emptied outside. Where? Behind the station. Holmes gave a faint smile. Of course. Lestrade groaned. We cannot dig through the rubbish of Euston. No. Holmes turned toward the window. We shall not need to. A clerk entered carrying a bundle. The coat, sir. Holmes took it. It was a grey travelling overcoat, heavy and expensive. He inspected the pockets, a silver key, a railway ticket, a handkerchief, a small brass token, and a folded piece of paper. Holmes opened it. The paper contained only a series of numbers. Then, beneath them, a single letter. A. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Watson. Yes? Do you recall Bellamy's words? When you see 17, look for what is missing. Precisely. He folded the paper. What is missing here? I looked at the numbers. I cannot say. Neither can I. Lestrade looked astonished. You mean you don't know? Not yet. Holmes placed the paper inside an evidence envelope. Then he examined the brass token. It was circular, slightly larger than a sovereign, with the number 17 engraved upon one side. On the reverse was a symbol resembling a railway signal. Holmes turned it over several times. Interesting. What is it? Lestrade asked. A ticket. For what? I don't know. He placed it beside the paper. At that instant, a loud whistle echoed across the station. Holmes looked toward the platform. A train had begun to move. Watson. Yes? Where is Sir Reginald? Still under protection, I believe. No. Holmes's expression changed. Lestrade, who was assigned to guard him. The inspector frowned. 2 constables. Names? Constable Miller and Constable Graves. Where are they now? Lestrade's face went pale. He rushed from the office. Holmes and I followed. The constables were nowhere to be found. Neither was Sir Reginald. His carriage had been discovered in a side street 3 blocks from Euston. The door stood open. Inside was Sir Reginald's hut. Nothing else. Holmes entered the carriage and examined the seat. He picked up the hat. There was a tiny spot of white powder upon its brim. He looked at me. Watson. Yes? We have just lost our principal witness. Do you think he has been kidnapped? Holmes shook his head. No. Then where is he? Holmes looked at the empty road. I think Sir Reginald has gone willingly. Willingly? Or believes he has? He held the hat beneath the light. There is something else. What? A small piece of paper had been tucked inside the headband. Holmes removed it. There were only 4 words. The Zeventon's signal is green. He read it twice. Then his expression became one I had rarely seen upon his face. Not fear, not surprise. Something far more troubling. Recognition. Holmes, I said, what does it mean? He folded the message. It means the murderer has stopped hiding. And what will he do? Holmes looked toward the railway lines disappearing into the fog. He is going to make his next move in public. He paused. And Watson, I believe the target will not be Sir Reginald. I stared at him. Then who? Holmes turned slowly toward me. Me. For perhaps half a minute after Holmes had uttered those words, I could only stare at him. The station behind us was alive with movement, yet I had the strange sensation that we stood isolated from the entire world. A porter hurried past carrying a trunk. A whistle shrieked from the platform, and somewhere beneath the great iron roof an engine gave a deep, resonant cough. Holmes, however, seemed to hear none of it. You, I said at last. Yes, Watson, but why? That, said Holmes, is the question our adversary would prefer us to ask before we ask the more useful one. And what is the more useful question? Why would he wish me to believe that I am his target? Lestrade returned at that moment, his face flushed with anger. Holmes, this is no time for philosophical games. Ashcombe has disappeared, 2 constables are missing, and we have no idea where he has gone. Holmes handed him the scrap of paper. Lestrade read it. The 17th signal is green. Yes. What does it mean? It means precisely what it says. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I possess. Lestrade thrust the paper toward him. You have been 1 step ahead of us since yesterday. Now you tell me that you do not know. I have never claimed to know everything. You certainly behave as though you do. Holmes smiled faintly. That is because uncertainty is more effective when concealed. I intervened before Lestrade could reply. Holmes, if we are to find Sir Reginald, surely the first step is to determine where he was taken. No. Why not? Because he was not taken. He walked toward the carriage in which Sir Reginald had been traveling. Look at the wheels. Lestrade stared at him. What about them? Nothing. He crouched beside the rear wheel. Then he touched the mud upon the lower frame. This carriage has traveled approximately 3 miles. How can you know that? Because the mud is fresh, the road surface has a particular composition, and the accumulation is heavier on the right wheel than the left. The carriage has passed through a construction area and then made a sharp turn. Lestat shook his head. You cannot possibly determine the distance from that. I have not determined it from that alone. Holmes pointed toward the roadway. There are the tracks. I looked down. 2 sets of carriage wheel marks crossed the wet road. One was narrow and belonged to a hansom. The other was broader. The carriage turned here, Holmes continued. It did not continue toward the station. And where did it go? Toward the river. Lestat's expression hardened. The Thames? Yes. Then Ashcombe may have been murdered. Possibly. We must search the river. No. Why? Because if Sir Reginald had been killed, his hat would not have been left behind. Lestat stared at him. That is absurd. No. It is human. Holmes lifted the hat. A man about to murder another does not generally preserve his victim's hat unless he has a reason. What reason? To make us believe the victim is dead. I felt a chill. You think Sir Reginald is still alive? I think someone wants us to believe he is dead. Which is not the same thing. Precisely, Watson. Holmes placed the hat back inside the carriage. Let us return to the station. As we walked, I noticed that Holmes had become unusually silent. His face was pale, and there was a tightness around his mouth which suggested that the case had touched some intellectual nerve that I did not yet understand. Once inside the station, he requested the railway timetables. The superintendent produced several. Holmes spread them across a desk. Watson, what do you see? A timetable. More specifically, trains leaving Manchester for London. Good. And what do you notice? I studied the columns. There are several express services. Indeed, some arrive at Euston at different times. Yes. And there are alterations to the signaling schedule. Holmes looked at me sharply. Excellent. I merely noticed the changes, and that is precisely how observation begins. He tapped one entry. Look here. It was a notation concerning the Western Northern Express. The scheduled signal sequence had been altered on the previous evening. At a particular junction outside Stafford, the train was marked to receive a green signal at a time when the line ahead was recorded as occupied by a maintenance train. That cannot be right, I said. No. Then why was it allowed? Because someone changed the record. Lestrade leaned over the desk. Can you prove that? Holmes pointed to the ink. This alteration was made after the original timetable was printed. By whom? That is what we shall discover. The railway superintendent had become visibly uncomfortable. I assure you, Mr. Holmes, no unauthorized person could have access to those records. Holmes looked at him. Who maintains the signal books? The station signalman. Name? Thomas Rook. Bring him here. The superintendent hesitated. Mr. Rook has been absent since last night. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Absent? Yes. Why? He failed to report for duty. Has he done so before? Never. Where does he live? Near the Stafford Junction. Holmes smiled without amusement. Then we have found another passenger who has mysteriously vanished. Lestrade immediately sent a constable to obtain the man's address. Holmes continued examining the timetable. Watson. Yes? Do you remember the sentence in Professor Vale's notebook? The signal cannot be trusted when the light remains green. Yes. And now we have a green signal. Exactly. You think the two are connected? I think everything is connected. He tapped the table. The dead professor, the missing overcoat, the brass token, the number 17, the altered signal, Sir Reginald's disappearance, the mysterious message. And the man in the carriage? Holmes looked at me. What man? The man Sir Reginald said he saw reflected in the window. For the first time that morning, Holmes smiled. Ah, you had forgotten? No, you knew I would mention him. I hoped you would. What does he have to do with the case? Perhaps everything. Before I could press him, the station telegraph operator hurried toward us. Inspector Lestrade? Yes, there is a message from Stafford. What does it say? The operator handed him a telegram. Lestrade read it. His expression changed. Rook has been found. Holmes reached for the telegram. Where? Inside the signal box. Alive? Lestrade hesitated. No. Holmes read the message himself. Cause of death? Gunshot. I felt a weight settle in my chest. Another murder. Holmes folded the telegram. Not another. What do you mean? The same murder. Lestrade stared at him. That makes no sense. It will. Holmes turned to the superintendent. How long does it take to reach Stafford by the next express? About 2 hours. Then we have no time to waste. You intend to go there? Yes. Why? Holmes picked up his hat. Because someone has left us a trail. Lestrade followed him. You think the killer wants us to follow it? No? Then why leave one? Holmes paused at the station entrance. Because a trail is not always designed to lead you somewhere. He looked back at me. Sometimes it is designed to make you believe you have arrived. We boarded the next train for Stafford shortly after noon. The journey began beneath a sky of dull iron, and rain streaked the carriage windows as the countryside passed in blurred patches of brown and green. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers joined beneath his chin. Lestrade occupied the adjoining seat, visibly irritated by the fact that Holmes had refused to explain his theory. At last the inspector could bear the silence no longer. You said the murders are connected. Yes. How? I do not yet know. Then why say it? Because the same weapon was used. Lestrade leaned forward. How can you know that? The bullet recovered from Professor Vale's body. Holmes removed the evidence envelope from his pocket. The medical examiner described it as a standard revolver bullet. And it was not fired from a standard revolver. Lestrade frowned. What was it fired from? A specially modified weapon. Can you identify it? Yes. Then tell us. Holmes looked out the window. A railway signaling pistol. Lestrade stared. What? A signaling pistol is designed to fire colored cartridges rather than conventional bullets. But with sufficient modification, the mechanism can discharge a small projectile. I remembered the darkened bullet. The discoloration. Exactly. The white powder? Residue from the modified cartridge. And the green signal? Holmes nodded. Now you begin to see the pattern. I leaned forward. Then someone connected with the railway killed Professor Vale. Yes. And Rook? The same person. Why? That is what remains hidden. The train thundered through the countryside. For a while there was silence. Then Holmes spoke again. Watson, suppose you wish to kill a man aboard a train without being seen. I should find a private compartment. Too obvious. I should wait until the train was moving. Better. I should create an alibi. Better still. And I should remove the weapon. Holmes smiled. Precisely. But Professor Vale's body was found in a locked compartment, which means the murderer escaped before the door was locked, or the door was locked before the murder was discovered. Yes. Holmes nodded. Now suppose the victim was dead before the train departed. The killer could place the body aboard the train. Exactly, but why? To create a false time of death. I stared at him. Then the murder occurred in Manchester, possibly. And the killer traveled separately, perhaps. Then Professor Vale's body was merely transported. Yes, but why make it appear that he was alive? Holmes leaned back. Because someone needed a witness to hear his voice. I felt a sudden chill. The voice from compartment 17. Exactly. You mean the voice Sir Reginald heard? Yes, but how could a dead man speak? Holmes's eyes gleamed. That is the question. At that moment the train gave a violent lurch. Lestrade caught the edge of the table. What was that? Holmes rose immediately. He went to the window. Outside, the signal beside the track was glowing green. Holmes's face became grim. Watson. Yes? Look at the signal. I did. It is green. Holmes checked his watch. What time is it? 3 minutes past 2. He nodded. Exactly as Professor Vale recorded. The train continued forward. Then suddenly Holmes pulled the emergency cord. The carriage jerked violently. What are you doing? Lestrade shouted. Holmes ignored him. He pointed through the window. Far ahead, beyond a bend in the line, a maintenance train stood motionless across the adjacent track. A collision was impossible only because our train was on a separate line. But the signal ahead had been altered. Holmes watched it. Then he smiled. The trap has begun. A railway official came rushing through the corridor. Who pulled that cord? I did, said Holmes. You have caused a serious delay. Possibly, you must pay a penalty. Holmes handed him his card. The man read it and immediately stepped backward. Mr. Holmes. Yes, what is wrong? Holmes pointed toward the signal. Who controls that signal? The signalman at Stafford Junction. Thomas Rook? The official hesitated. Rook is dead. Holmes' eyes hardened. Then who changed it? The official said nothing. Holmes stepped closer. Who? I don't know. Holmes stared at him for several seconds. Then he reached into his pocket. Perhaps this will help. He showed the man the brass token marked 17. The official's face drained of color. You have seen this before? No. Holmes watched him carefully. Yes. The official backed away. I must return to my post. He turned. Holmes seized his wrist. Not yet. The man struggled. Then something fell from his coat. A small metal object struck the floor. Holmes picked it up. It was a key. On the handle were the engraved initials. SR. Lestrade stared. Sir Reginald? Holmes shook his head. No. He examined the key. These are not Sir Reginald's initials. Then whose? Holmes looked at the railway official. The man had gone completely white. Samuel Rook, Holmes said. Thomas Rook, Lestrade corrected. Holmes smiled. No Lestrade. He held up the key. The dead signalman was not Thomas Rook. The official suddenly broke free. He ran toward the rear of the train. Lestrade shouted. The man disappeared through the connecting door. Holmes did not pursue him. Instead, he turned to me. Watson, we have just discovered something far more important than a murderer. What? Holmes held the key between his fingers. The man who died in the signal box was using a false name. And the real Thomas Rook? Holmes looked toward the green signal glowing in the distance. I believe he is still alive. The train began moving again. And somewhere ahead of us, hidden beyond the fog and rain, the 17th signal remained green. The discovery of the false identity of the dead signalman cast a peculiar shadow over the remainder of our journey. Lestrade, who had at first been inclined to regard the affair as a straightforward railway murder, now sat opposite Holmes with his arms folded and his brows knitted together in concentrated thought. The railway official who had fled from us had disappeared into the rear carriages, and although a search had been made through the train, he had vanished as completely as though the wheels themselves had swallowed him. Holmes, for his part, appeared almost indifferent to the escape. You allowed him to get away, I remarked. My dear Watson, I did nothing of the sort. But you could have followed him, certainly. Then why did you not? Because a frightened man is more useful when he believes himself free. Lestrade gave a grunt. You could have said that before he escaped. I could have, but then he might have remained. The inspector shook his head. You make everything unnecessarily complicated, only because everything unnecessarily complicated has been placed before us. He turned the brass key over in his fingers. The initials SR were plainly visible upon its handle. You said these were not Sir Reginald's initials, I remarked. You believe they belonged to Samuel Rook. No, I said the man calling himself Thomas Rook was not Thomas Rook. The initials may belong to Samuel Rook, but I have not yet established that fact. Then who was Samuel Rook? That is precisely what interests me. Holmes opened the railway directory which he had obtained from the superintendent before we departed. He turned several pages, tracing names with the tip of his finger. Here. He pointed to a small entry. Samuel Rook, Assistant Signal Engineer, Western Northern Railway, dismissed in 1889. Dismissed? Yes. For what? Holmes read the entry again. Unauthorized alteration of signaling equipment. Lestrade leaned over. That sounds promising. It sounds convenient. What is the difference? The difference between a clue and a planted clue. He closed the directory. Someone wants us to find Samuel Rook. Why? Perhaps because Samuel Rook is innocent. Or because he is guilty. Exactly. I watched the countryside slipping beyond the window. Holmes, there is something I do not understand. There are several things you do not understand. I mean the dead man. Which dead man? Professor Vale. Holmes nodded. If his body was placed aboard the train before departure, why did Sir Reginald hear his voice? An excellent question. You have a theory? I have 3. Which is correct? I shall tell you when I have eliminated the other 2. Lestrade looked up. Could the voice have been recorded? Holmes turned toward him. An interesting suggestion. I am serious. So am I. Then it is possible? Certainly, a mechanical recording device could reproduce a human voice. Primitive ones existed decades ago. But how could such a device be concealed in the compartment? It need not have been concealed. Lestrade frowned. Holmes continued. Remember the 3 knocks. I recalled Sir Reginald's account. 3 knocks from inside compartment 17. Then the voice. You think the knocks were mechanical? I think they were designed. And the voice? Possibly reproduced. But why use Sir Reginald's name? To convince him that Professor Vale was alive. Why would the killer care what Sir Reginald believed? Holmes's expression became thoughtful, because fear is a very efficient instrument. The train began to slow. A distant cluster of buildings appeared through the mist. Stafford, said Lestrade. Holmes rose. Not yet. What do you mean? Look at the platform. I looked. Several railway officials were waiting. Among them stood a tall, thin man in a dark coat. He was staring directly at our carriage. Holmes moved to the window. The stranger immediately turned away. Do you know him? I asked. No. You appear interested. I am. Why? He has been waiting for us. The train entered the station. As it came to a stop, Holmes remained seated. Watson, stay here. Why? Because if I am correct, someone will attempt to prevent us from leaving. The carriage doors opened. Passengers descended. Porters rushed forward. The tall stranger was nowhere to be seen. Lestrade stepped onto the platform. What are you waiting for? Holmes joined him. For our friend. Which friend? Holmes pointed toward the far end of the platform. A railway porter was walking rapidly away. Follow him. Lestrade and I hurried after the man. He entered a narrow service passage beside the station buildings. Holmes followed without hesitation. The passage opened into a small courtyard filled with crates and coal. The porter stopped. He turned. I don't know anything. Holmes regarded him calmly. I have asked you nothing. The man looked confused. Then why are you following me? Because you have been following us. The porter swallowed. I was only doing my duty. Whose duty? The man said nothing. Holmes approached him. You were on the platform when our train arrived. Yes, you knew which carriage we occupied. I saw you. You left before we reached the station. I had work to do. Then why did you lead us here? The man's face tightened. I didn't. Holmes looked down. There were fresh footprints in the mud. They led from the platform to the courtyard. One set belonged to the porter. Another continued beyond him toward a small wooden door. Holmes pointed. Who went through there? The porter shook his head. I don't know. Holmes opened the door. Beyond it was a narrow room filled with railway tools. On the wall hung several signal lanterns. One was missing. Holmes inspected the empty hook. What color was the missing lantern? Green, said the porter. Lestrade swore beneath his breath. Holmes turned. Where is the nearest signal box? 200 yards east. Then we go there. The porter suddenly moved. He struck Lestrade in the chest and ran. The inspector stumbled. I attempted to pursue him, but Holmes seized my arm. Leave him. But he may know. He knows less than we need. We reached the signal box several minutes later. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold. The body of the supposed Thomas Rook had already been removed, but the room remained almost untouched. Holmes examined the machinery. There, he pointed to the signal lever controlling the 17th junction. The mechanism had been altered. A thin wire had been attached beneath the lever. What does that do? I asked. It allows the signal to be controlled remotely. From where? Holmes followed the wire with his eyes. It disappears beneath the floor. Lestrade crouched beside him. Then someone could operate the signal without being inside the box. Yes. From the railway? Perhaps. Holmes tapped the floorboards. Or from below. We removed several boards. Beneath them was a narrow maintenance tunnel. Cold air rose from the darkness. Lestrade lit a lamp. There is a passage. Holmes descended first. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one man. It ran beneath the railway line and was supported by old brick arches blackened by moisture and soot. After perhaps 50 yards, Holmes stopped. A small metal box was fixed to the wall. He opened it. Inside was a collection of wires, batteries, and mechanical components. A remote signaling device, he said. Could this have been used to change the signal? Yes. Then we have our method. Holmes shook his head. No, why not? Because we have only the method. He held up a small piece of paper found inside the box. And not the motive. The paper contained a list of times. 10:15, 10:40, 11:05, 11:30, 11:55. Beside each time was a single letter. A, B, C, D, E. Holmes stared at the list. What does it mean? I asked. He did not answer. Instead, he looked toward the tunnel. Watson. Yes? Do you hear that? I listened. At first there was nothing. Then came a faint sound. Footsteps. Someone was approaching from the darkness. Lestrade drew his revolver. Holmes raised a hand. Do not fire. The footsteps came closer. A figure emerged into the lamplight. He was an elderly man with a grey beard and railwayman's coat. He stopped when he saw us. Mr. Holmes? Yes. My name is Thomas Rook. Lestrade lowered his revolver. You are alive. The old man gave a bitter smile. Unfortunately. Holmes stepped forward. Where have you been? Hiding. From whom? Rook looked toward the tunnel behind him. From the men who killed my assistant. Your assistant? The man you found in the signal box. You knew he was using your name? Yes. Why? Rook's expression darkened. Because he was ordered to. By whom? I don't know. Holmes studied him. You are lying. Rook stiffened. I assure you, you know exactly who ordered him. No. Then why have you been hiding? Because I was afraid. Of whom? Rook looked directly at Holmes. Sir Reginald Ashcombe. Lestrade stepped forward. You think Ashcombe arranged the murders? I know he was involved. Holmes remained silent. Rook continued. Professor Vale discovered what they were doing. What were they doing? Changing signals. We know that. No, said Rook, you do not. He pointed toward the mechanism. The signals were not being changed to cause accidents. Then why? Rook lowered his voice. To make certain trains disappear. I stared at him. Disappear. Not literally. He looked toward Holmes. Trains carrying something valuable were being diverted onto abandoned lines. Their cargo was removed. Then the signals were restored before anyone realized the route had changed. Holmes's eyes narrowed. What cargo? I never knew. Who arranged it? I saw only one man. Who? Rook hesitated. Then he whispered, Sir Reginald Ashcombe. Lestrade immediately stepped forward. But Ashcombe himself has disappeared. Rook shook his head. No. What do you mean? He has not disappeared. Holmes's face became very still. Where is he? Rook looked frightened. He is on this railway. Where? On the next train to London. Holmes stared at him. Impossible. Rook shook his head. I saw him myself. When? 20 minutes ago. Where? On the platform. Holmes's eyes flashed. The tall man. Rook nodded. Yes. And why did he not approach us? Because he did not want you to know he was watching. Holmes stepped closer. Rook, tell me everything you know. The old signalman looked at him. There is something you must understand, Mr. Holmes. What? The man you think is Sir Reginald Ashcombe may not be Sir Reginald Ashcombe. I felt a sudden chill. Holmes did not move. What did you say? Rook's voice trembled. I saw the real Sir Reginald die 3 years ago. The silence inside that underground tunnel was absolute. Lestrade stared at him. That is impossible. I have personally met Sir Reginald. So have I, said Rook. Then explain yourself. Rook looked at Holmes. The man sitting in Sir Reginald Ashcombe's house, signing his documents, attending his meetings, and giving orders to railway officials, he swallowed, is an impostor. Holmes's expression became unreadable. Who is he? I don't know. Then how do you know he is not Ashcombe? Because I knew the real man. How? Rook reached inside his coat and removed an old photograph. He handed it to Holmes. Holmes studied it. The photograph showed 3 men standing beside a railway platform. One was unmistakably Sir Reginald Ashcombe. The second was Professor Adrian Vale. The third was a younger man with sharp features and dark hair. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Who is the third man? Rook whispered. Samuel Rook. Holmes looked up. The man we believed was dead. Rook nodded. He was never dismissed. Then what happened? He disappeared. When? 3 years ago. Holmes turned the photograph over. Written on the back were 5 words. The fourth man was never seen. Holmes stared at them. Watson, he said quietly, Yes, we have been looking for a murderer. He placed the photograph inside his coat, but I believe we have stumbled upon something far more dangerous. What? A conspiracy in which the dead have been given names belonging to the living. Before I could reply, a violent metallic clang echoed through the tunnel. Holmes turned. A signal lever above us had moved. Somewhere in the distance, a bell began ringing. Rook went white. No. Holmes seized his arm. What is it? The 17th signal. What about it? Rook looked toward the darkness. It has changed. To what? Rook whispered. Red. Holmes smiled grimly. Then our enemy has finally made a mistake. Lestrade looked at him. Why? Because until now, he has been trying to control what we believe. Holmes turned toward the tunnel entrance. But a red signal means he is trying to stop something. What? Holmes checked his watch. Whatever is approaching us. At that instant, from somewhere deep beneath the earth, came the unmistakable thunder of an approaching train. The sound grew steadily louder until the very bricks beneath our feet seemed to tremble. Dust sifted from the old arches above us, and the hanging lamp in the signal tunnel swung gently upon its hook. Thomas Rook stood rigid against the wall, his face drained of color, while Lestrade drew his revolver and glanced toward the darkness. Holmes, I said, there is no railway line beneath us. Not an active one, he replied. The thunder became a roar. Then, suddenly it ceased. The silence that followed was more alarming than the noise itself. Holmes moved forward, holding his lamp high. The tunnel ahead appeared empty, save for the glistening rails that ran through its center. Rails? Lestrade exclaimed. Rook nodded grimly. This line was abandoned in 1878, and yet a train has just passed upon it, said Holmes. No, replied Rook. He pointed into the darkness. It has not passed. Holmes looked at him. It is still there. We heard it then, the slow metallic groaning of wheels coming to a halt somewhere beyond the bend. Holmes immediately extinguished his lamp. Remain silent. We obeyed. A faint yellow light appeared around the curve. Then another, and another. A locomotive emerged from the darkness, moving at little more than walking pace. It was an old engine, black with soot, its lamps dim and its sides streaked with moisture. Behind it were 3 dark carriages. The strange thing was that there was no driver visible. The locomotive rolled to a stop, perhaps 30 yards from us. Holmes remained perfectly still. The engine hissed. Then a door opened on the first carriage. A man stepped down. He wore a dark railway uniform and carried a lantern. He looked toward the signal mechanism, then toward the tunnel. He had not seen us. Holmes leaned toward me. Watson, remain here. Before I could object, he slipped into the shadows and began moving silently along the wall. The stranger walked toward the signal apparatus. He crouched beside the mechanism and opened a small metal panel. Holmes reached him before he could react. The man cried out and attempted to run. Lestrade seized him. The struggle was brief. Within seconds, the man was handcuffed. Who are you? Lestrade demanded. The prisoner remained silent. Holmes examined his hands, then his boots, then his coat. You have been underground for some time. The man stared at him. How do you know? Your cuffs are stained with iron dust. Your boots contain clay identical to that found in compartment 17, and you have a burn upon your right thumb. The man's expression changed. Holmes smiled. A signaling mechanism. Still no answer. Your name? Asked Lestrade. The man looked at Rook. The old signalman recoiled. I know him. Who is he? I asked. Rook whispered. James Armitage. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Armitage? He worked under me years ago. Where? Stafford. What happened to him? Rook shook his head. He disappeared with Samuel Rook. The prisoner finally spoke. You should not have come here. Holmes regarded him calmly. That is becoming a familiar sentiment. Armitage looked toward the train. You do not understand what you are interfering with. Then you may enlighten us. I cannot. Cannot or will not. Both. Holmes walked toward the first carriage. Armitage suddenly struggled against Lestrade. Don't open that. Holmes stopped. Why? The man said nothing. Holmes smiled. Thank you. He climbed into the carriage. I followed. Inside were 6 wooden crates. Each was sealed with black wax. No markings identified their contents. Holmes examined the nearest crate. What is inside? Armitage remained silent. Holmes produced a small knife. Perhaps we shall discover it ourselves. He cut the wax. Lestrade looked over his shoulder. Inside were metal cylinders, each carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes removed one. It was a railway signaling component. Parts, I said. Yes. For what? Holmes examined the mechanism. To alter signals remotely. Lestrade cursed. Then this is where the equipment comes from. Some of it. Holmes looked toward the other crates. We have discovered the machinery. But not the purpose, I said. Correct. He opened a second crate. This one contained documents. Railway schedules, freight manifests, maps. Holmes spread several across the carriage floor. His expression changed. Watson. I leaned over. What? Look at these routes. The maps showed several railway lines crossing northern England. Red marks had been placed at isolated junctions. Each was accompanied by a number, and beside them were dates. Holmes studied the pattern. Every diverted train carried valuable cargo, he said. Gold? Not always. Then what? He picked up a manifest. Machine components. Another. Government documents. Another. Industrial diamonds. Lestrade stared. So the railway company was stealing from its customers. Perhaps. Holmes turned another page. Not stealing. What then? Testing. I looked at him. Testing what? He pointed to the final manifest. Human beings. A chill passed through me. The document listed passengers. 23 names. Next to each was a small notation. Some were marked with a circle, others with a cross. One name had been underlined twice. Edward Bellamy. I felt my heart tighten. Bellamy? Holmes nodded. The younger brother of Professor Vale. Lestrade took the paper. Why would they be tracking him? Because he knows something. Or because they want him dead. Holmes's expression hardened. Both may be true. A sound came from the next carriage. A faint knock. 3 times. Holmes froze. Knock, knock, knock. I remembered Sir Reginald's story. The 3 knocks from compartment 17. Holmes moved toward the connecting door. Stay behind me. He opened it. The carriage was empty. At the far end stood another door. It was locked. Holmes examined the lock. Then he turned to me. Watson, do you smell that? I breathed carefully. There was a faint chemical odor in the air. Yes, the same substance from compartment 17. Then Professor Vale was here? No. Holmes pointed to the floor. A thin trail of white powder led toward the locked door. He followed it. Lestrade raised his revolver. Stand aside. Holmes ignored him. He inserted the brass key marked SR into the lock. It turned. The door opened. Inside was a narrow compartment containing a chair, a table, and a phonograph. I stared. A recording machine. Holmes approached it. The cylinder was still turning. Then a voice emerged from the horn. A man's voice. Calm, measured, familiar. Sir Reginald Ashcombe, you should never have boarded this train. I felt the blood drain from my face. Holmes stopped the machine. The voice. Yes, he said. Professor Vale. Not necessarily, but it is his voice. Indeed. He examined the phonograph. The recording was made recently. How can you tell? The wax is fresh. He looked at the cylinder. And there is something else. What? Holmes pointed to a faint mark engraved upon the edge. 17A. The same notation from the signal records. Lestrade entered the compartment. So the voice was recorded. Yes. Then Sir Reginald was deceived. Precisely. And the killer expected him to hear it. Yes. Why? Holmes looked at him. Because the killer needed Sir Reginald frightened enough to leave his compartment. But why would he leave? Because the voice told him that he was in danger. And then, Holmes's eyes became cold. He became predictable. A sudden noise came from the corridor. Footsteps. Holmes immediately extinguished the lamp. Someone was approaching. The door opened. A figure entered. He was tall and dressed in a dark overcoat. Holmes remained hidden. The stranger approached the phonograph. He lifted the cylinder. Then he turned. For a fraction of a second, the light from the corridor revealed his face. I recognized him. So did Holmes. It was the man we had seen on the Stafford platform, the man who had been watching us. The stranger smiled. Good evening, Mr. Holmes. Holmes stepped from the shadows. Good evening. The man's smile disappeared. He reached inside his coat. Lestrade raised his revolver. "Don't." The stranger froze. Holmes stared at him. "You are Samuel Rook." The man said nothing. Thomas Rook, standing behind us, gave a strangled cry. "Samuel?" The stranger turned toward the old signalman. For the first time his composure broke. "You should have remained hidden." Thomas Rook stared at him. "You were supposed to be dead." Samuel smiled bitterly. "So were you." Holmes watched them both. "Then perhaps we can finally stop pretending." Samuel Rook's eyes moved toward Holmes. "You have uncovered too much. Not enough. You think this is about railway theft. It is not? No. Then tell me what it is about." Samuel looked at the crates. The railway was merely the instrument. For what? He hesitated. Then he said, "To move people without them knowing where they were going." Lestrade frowned. "What does that mean?" Samuel looked at Holmes. "The trains were used to transport witnesses." "Witnesses to what?" "The Ashcombe affair." Holmes's face became very still. "What affair?" Samuel said nothing. Thomas Rook stepped forward. "Tell him." Samuel looked at his father. "You know what happens if I do. I know what happens if you don't." Samuel's expression hardened. Then the lights went out. There was a sharp metallic click. A gunshot exploded in the darkness. Lestrade shouted. I heard Holmes move. Then came the sound of someone falling. When the lamps were relit, Samuel Rook was gone. The rear door stood open. But there was blood upon the floor. Holmes crouched beside it. "Whose blood?" I asked. He touched it carefully. "Samuel's." "Then he was wounded." "Yes." Lestrade ran toward the tunnel. Holmes stopped him. "Don't." "Why?" "Because that is exactly what he wants." Lestrade turned angrily. "He escaped." "No." Holmes looked toward the blood trail. "He left us a trail, and—" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "It leads in the wrong direction." He stood. Then he looked at the phonograph. The cylinder had begun turning again. A voice came from the machine. Not Professor Vale's, not Samuel Rook's. A voice I recognized instantly. "Sir Reginald Ashcombe." "Mr. Holmes," it said calmly. "If you are hearing this, then you have found the train." Holmes stared at the machine. The recording continued. "You have also discovered the men who have been operating it, but you have not yet discovered the truth." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Professor Vale was not killed because of what he discovered." Holmes's eyes hardened. "He was killed because of what he remembered." The recording ended. For several seconds no one moved. Then Holmes turned toward me. "Watson." "Yes?" "We must return to London." "Why?" "Because Edward Bellamy is in immediate danger." Lestrade looked at him. "How do you know?" Holmes held up the final railway manifest. The name Edward Bellamy was marked with a black circle. Beside it was a time. Midnight. Holmes checked his watch. "It is 7:30. And the next train?" Holmes looked toward the tunnel, the one standing before us. "But where does it go?" Holmes's face was grim. "London." Thomas Rook suddenly seized Holmes's arm. "No." Holmes turned. "You cannot go." "Why?" "Because that train does not arrive in London." "Where does it go?" Rook looked toward the dark tunnel. "To Rothwick." The name meant nothing to me. Holmes, however, reacted immediately. "Rothwick Manor?" Rook nodded. "The Ashcombe estate." Holmes stared at him. "Then we have found the destination." "No," said Rook. He looked toward the tunnel with terror in his eyes. "You have found the beginning." At that moment the engine whistle shrieked. The underground train began to move. Holmes seized his hat. "Watson, we are going aboard." Lestrade stared at him. "Without knowing what awaits us?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "My dear Lestrade, that has never stopped us before." And as the train disappeared into the darkness, carrying its secret cargo toward Rothwick Manor, I had the uneasy conviction that the most dangerous portion of our investigation had only just begun. The underground train carried us through a darkness so complete that it seemed less like traveling through a tunnel than passing beneath the foundations of the world itself. The carriage shook with every turn, and the ancient lamps above our heads gave off an unsteady yellow glow which left the corners in perpetual shadow. Thomas Rook sat opposite Holmes, his hands clasped tightly upon his knees, while Lestrade remained near the door, his revolver within easy reach. I occupied the seat beside Holmes, watching my friend's face as he studied the maps recovered from the railway carriage. For nearly 20 minutes he spoke not a word. At last I could bear the silence no longer. Holmes, what is Rothwick Manor? A house? I can see that. Then you already know something about it. I mean its connection with the case. Holmes folded the map. Rothwick Manor was built in 1764 by Sir Malcolm Ashcombe, the first of the family to acquire substantial railway interests in the north. Then the Ashcombes have owned it for generations? Yes. And you have never heard of this underground railway? No. Then how did it come to exist? Holmes looked toward Thomas Rook. That is a question for our companion, the old signalman sighed. The line was originally constructed as a private mineral railway. Coal was carried from the northern pits to a junction near Stafford. When the mines became unprofitable, the line was abandoned. And the tunnel? Sealed? Apparently not. Rook shook his head. The Ashcombes reopened it secretly. When? About 4 years ago. Holmes leaned forward. Why? I was never told. You were a signalman. I maintained the main railway. The private line was outside my authority. Yet you knew of it. I knew there was activity beneath the old junction. Why did you not report it? Rook looked down. Because I was afraid. Holmes's expression softened slightly. Of the Ashcombes? Of what they were doing. What were they doing? Rook hesitated. Transporting people. Lestrade frowned. You have already told us that. Yes. But where were these people coming from? I don't know. Who were they? I don't know. Holmes interrupted. You do know. Rook looked at him. Holmes's voice was quiet. You may not know every name, but you know what kind of people they were. Rook stared at the floor. Witnesses. To what? The disappearance of certain railway shipments. Lestrade frowned. What shipments? Rook shook his head. You must understand. The railway thefts were only the surface. Holmes looked at him sharply. What was beneath the surface? Money. That is hardly surprising. Not ordinary money. Rook reached inside his coat and removed a small notebook. He opened it carefully. There were accounts. Whose? Several companies. Holmes took the notebook. The pages contained columns of figures and initials. He read them silently. Then he looked up. These are payments. Yes. To whom? Rook hesitated. Government officials. Lestrade stiffened. You are accusing government officials of conspiracy? I am telling you what I saw. Holmes turned another page. There are names here. Yes. Why did Professor Vale investigate this? Because he discovered that railway signals were being used to conceal the movement of money and people. Did he know who was responsible? Rook shook his head. Not at first. When did he discover? 3 months ago. Holmes looked toward the dark window. And then he died. Yes. Or appeared to die. Rook frowned. What do you mean? Holmes did not answer. The train began to slow. A distant light appeared ahead. Then another. The tunnel widened, revealing a stone platform hidden beneath the earth. The train came to a stop. No railway officials waited for us. No porters, no passengers, only silence. Holmes rose. Everyone remained together. We stepped onto the platform. A narrow staircase led upward. At the top stood a heavy wooden door. Holmes examined it. There is no lock. Lestrade frowned. Then how is it secured? Holmes pushed. The door opened. Cold night air rushed into the passage. We emerged into a wooded valley. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the trees stood black against the sky. In the distance, beyond a line of bare branches, I saw the silhouette of an enormous manor. Rothwick Manor. It stood upon a low hill, its stone walls pale beneath the moonlight. Numerous windows were dark, but a single light burned in a tower at the eastern end. Holmes studied the house. Watson. Yes? Count the chimneys. I looked. 1, 2, 3, 4. I continued. 8. Good. What significance do they have? None. Then why? Because if I asked you to count the windows, you would have counted the wrong thing. I sighed. Holmes? He smiled. I merely wished to confirm that you were still yourself. We began walking toward the manor. The path was muddy, and the trees pressed closely around us. Holmes moved with extraordinary caution, frequently stopping to examine the ground. What are you looking for? Lestrade whispered. Footprints. Whose? Anyone who has recently entered or left the estate. There are dozens. No, Holmes pointed. There are 3. I looked. The ground showed 3 distinct sets of footprints. One belonged to a heavy boot. Another was narrow and deep at the heel. The third was almost invisible. Holmes crouched beside it. This one is interesting. Why? Because it belongs to someone who does not wish to be noticed. Lestrade looked toward the house. Could it be Ashcombe? Possibly. Could it be Samuel Rook? Possibly. And the third? Holmes stood. The third is our most important. What do you mean? It was made by someone carrying considerable weight. Who? I do not know. He looked toward the manor. But I suspect we are about to find out. We reached the rear of the house. A service door stood slightly open. Holmes examined the handle. No dust. So someone uses it regularly, I said. Exactly. He entered. The passage beyond was narrow and dark. We moved silently through the servants' corridor until we reached a staircase. From somewhere above came the faint sound of music. A piano. Lestrade whispered. Someone is awake. Holmes nodded. We climbed. At the top was a long gallery filled with portraits. I recognized several members of the Ashcombe family from historical engravings. Holmes stopped before one particular painting. It showed a younger Sir Reginald Ashcombe standing beside a railway carriage. Beside him stood Professor Adrian Vale. And between them was a third man, Samuel Rook. Holmes studied the painting for several seconds. Watson. Yes? Look at Vale's hand. I examined the portrait. Professor Vale's right hand rested upon the shoulder of the younger Samuel Rook. What of it? He is holding something. A small brass token. Number 17. Holmes's face became grave. So the symbol existed long before the murder. Then what does 17 mean? Holmes looked at the portrait. Not a compartment. Not a signal. No. Then what? Holmes's eyes moved toward the tower. A person. Before I could ask what he meant, a door opened at the end of the gallery. A woman stepped into view. She was perhaps 35 years of age, dressed in a dark Victorian gown. Her pale face was composed, but her eyes were extraordinarily watchful. She looked directly at Holmes. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes bowed slightly. Madam, my name is Eleanor Ashcombe. Lestrade stepped forward. Are you related to Sir Reginald? She smiled faintly. I am his sister. Where is he? She looked at Holmes. That depends upon which Sir Reginald you mean. The words struck me like a blow. Holmes remained composed. How many are there? 2. Lestrade reached for his revolver. Holmes raised a hand. Not yet. Eleanor smiled. You are exactly as Professor Vale described you. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He spoke of me. Frequently. When? Before he died. Where did you know him? In this house. Holmes stepped closer. Then perhaps you can explain why Professor Vale was murdered. Eleanor's expression changed. I can explain why he was afraid. Of whom? She looked toward the tower. Of the man who inherited this house. Sir Reginald. No. Then who? She whispered. The first Sir Reginald. A cold silence filled the gallery. Lestrade stared at her. The first? Eleanor nodded. The man who supposedly died in 1887. Holmes's eyes became intensely focused. Supposedly? He did not die. What happened? He disappeared. And his identity? Eleanor looked at the portrait. The family never admitted the truth. Holmes turned toward the painting. Then the man currently known as Sir Reginald Ashcombe is not the man who inherited the title. I felt a chill. Who is he? Eleanor looked at Holmes. His son. Holmes frowned. But the son would be dead. She completed the sentence. Or believed to be. Suddenly a sound came from the tower. 3 knocks. Holmes turned immediately. Knock, knock, knock. The same 3 knocks. He moved toward the staircase. Eleanor seized his arm. No. Why? Because that is what he wants. Who? She looked up. Sir Reginald. Holmes gently removed her hand. Then I fear, madam, that we have already been invited. He began climbing. The staircase spiraled upward toward the tower. With each step, the temperature seemed to fall. At the top was a narrow corridor. A door stood at the end. It was locked. Holmes examined the keyhole. Then he smiled. What? Someone has locked it from the inside. Lestrade raised his revolver. Holmes stepped back. Stand aside. The inspector forced the door. It swung inward. The room beyond was empty, except for a chair, a table, a phonograph. and a man seated beside the window. I rushed forward. Holmes! The man was alive, but his face was concealed beneath a black cloth. Holmes approached. He removed the cloth. I recognized the face. Sir Reginald Ashcombe. He was bound to the chair. A deep wound marked his temple. Holmes checked his pulse. Alive. Lestrade stared. Then who was the man we saw on the platform? Holmes did not answer. He examined the table. There was a sheet of paper. Only one sentence had been written upon it. The wrong Ashcombe has been saved. Holmes looked toward Elinor. Madam. Yes. Where is your brother? She stared at him. I have only one brother. Holmes's expression became cold. No. He pointed toward the window. There are 2 sets of footprints leading to the tower. Elinor's face went white. One belongs to the man we have just found. And the other? Holmes looked into the darkness beyond the window. The other belongs to someone who left the house. Who? Holmes picked up the brass token lying beside Sir Reginald. Number 17. He turned it over. For the first time, I saw something engraved upon its reverse that had escaped our attention. A single word. H-I-R. Holmes stared at it. Then he whispered, Watson, I believe we have finally discovered what 17 represents. What? The Ashcombe heir. A shot rang out from the grounds below. Elinor screamed. Holmes rushed to the window. A figure was running across the lawn. Holmes watched for only a second. Then he turned toward us. Lestrade, stay with Sir Reginald. Where are you going? To meet the man who has been dead for 3 years. And before I could stop him, Holmes disappeared down the stairs into the darkness. I have often wondered whether the most dangerous moments of an investigation are those in which the truth appears nearest, or those in which it suddenly seems to retreat beyond our grasp. That night at Rothwick Manor, I experienced both sensations within the space of a few minutes. Holmes had vanished down the staircase, leaving Lestrade, Elinor Ashcombe and myself in the tower chamber with the unconscious Sir Reginald. Outside, the wind had risen, driving rain against the tall windows. Somewhere below, a door slammed with such violence that the sound traveled through the entire house. Watson, said Lestrade, examine him. I knelt beside Sir Reginald. His pulse was weak but regular. The wound upon his temple appeared severe, yet not immediately fatal. I loosened his collar and examined his pupils. He has been struck heavily, I said, but he may recover. Elinor stood motionless near the door. Then it is true. What? I asked. That there are 2. Lestrade looked sharply at her. 2 what? 2 men who have worn the name of Sir Reginald Ashcombe. You knew. She looked at him. I suspected. Since when? For 3 years. Lestrade's expression darkened. And you said nothing. I was afraid. You keep saying that. Because it was true. I could hear the anger in Lestrade's voice. You are telling us that your own family concealed the existence of an impostor while people were being murdered? No. Elinor looked toward the unconscious man. My family concealed something much worse. Before Lestrade could question her further, a sound came from the corridor. Footsteps. Slow, measured, approaching. Lestrade drew his revolver. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A voice spoke. Inspector Lestrade. We exchanged glances. It was Holmes. Lestrade lowered the weapon. The door opened. Holmes entered alone. His coat was wet, and there was a small cut upon his cheek. Where is he? I asked. Gone. The man from the lawn? Yes. Did you see his face? No. Lestrade looked astonished. You chased him and did not see him? I saw enough. Then who was he? Holmes removed his gloves. Samuel Rook. Elinor gave a sharp cry. No. Holmes turned toward her. You know him. I knew of him. You knew him personally. She shook her head. No. Holmes crossed the room. Then why did you react when I said his name? She remained silent. Holmes looked at me. Watson, examine the floor beside the window. I did so. There were wet footprints, 1 set. They began near the window and continued toward the door. Holmes crouched beside them. The man entered through the window. That is impossible, said Lestrade. The tower is 4 stories high. Exactly. Holmes examined the sill. There are scratches. Rope? No. He pointed upward. A narrow metal cable ran from the roof line toward the adjoining tower. A maintenance line, I said. Perhaps. Holmes stood. Or an escape route. Lestrade shook his head. You expect me to believe a murderer climbed 4 stories in the rain? I expect you to believe that someone did. Holmes walked to the phonograph. He inspected the cylinder. It has been changed. Changed? I asked. Yes. Then the message we heard earlier was recorded for us. He removed the cylinder and examined it. Recently. What does that tell us? That someone knew we would enter this room. Lestrade swore. So this entire scene was prepared. Precisely. Holmes looked at Sir Reginald. He was not meant to die. Why? Because he is evidence. Evidence of what? Holmes turned to Eleanor. Your brother. She stared at him. I told you, I have only one brother. No. Holmes's voice became quiet. You have 2. She shook her head. You are mistaken. Then why does this man possess a photograph taken inside this house 30 years ago? He produced the old photograph we had recovered from Thomas Rook. Eleanor looked at it. Her face changed. Holmes pointed to the youngest figure. This is Samuel Rook. Yes. And this man? He pointed to the second figure. Professor Adrian Vale. Yes. And the third? Sir Reginald Ashcombe. Yes. Holmes turned the photograph over. The date is written on the back. Eleanor looked. 1878. Holmes nodded. Professor Vale was 22 years old. Eleanor stared at him. And Samuel Rook was 19. Correct. But what does that prove? Holmes looked at her. Your father was not the first Ashcombe involved with the railway conspiracy. She said nothing. Your grandfather was. The room seemed to grow colder. Lestrade stepped closer. Holmes, what are you suggesting? That the conspiracy began decades ago. He pointed toward the photograph. These 3 men were not merely acquaintances. They were working together. Doing what? Building the private railway system beneath Rothwick. Eleanor whispered. No. Holmes continued. They used it to move goods, documents, and eventually people without the knowledge of the authorities. That is impossible, she said. Then why does the Underground Railway exist? She had no answer. Holmes approached the window. Your family built a hidden network. For what purpose? To control the movement of valuable information. Lestrade frowned. That still does not explain the murders. No. Holmes turned. It explains the motive. He pointed towards Sir Reginald. Professor Vale discovered that the network had been used for decades. By whom? By the Ashcombe family. Eleanor shook her head. My brother would never. Which brother? She froze. Holmes stepped toward her. You keep referring to my brother as though there were only one man in your memory. She looked at him with fear. There was one. No. Holmes's eyes hardened. You had an elder brother. Eleanor's lips trembled. He died. When? 1887. His name? She looked away. Reginald. Holmes nodded. The original Sir Reginald. Yes. What happened? He vanished. You said he died. We were told he died. By whom? My father. Holmes's expression became thoughtful. And did you believe him? Eleanor hesitated. No. Why? Because I saw him. When? 3 years later. Holmes' eyes sharpened. Where? In this house. Was he alive? Yes. What did he say? Eleanor's voice fell to a whisper. He told me to forget his name. A silence followed. Holmes looked at the unconscious man. Now we understand why there are 2 Ashcombes. Lestrade shook his head. I do not. The man in this room is not the original heir. Then who is he? Holmes walked to the fireplace. He examined the mantel. Then he stopped. There was a small brass plate beneath the clock. He pressed it. A section of the wall opened. Behind it was a narrow compartment. Inside lay several documents. Holmes removed the first, a birth certificate. The second, a death certificate. The third, a letter. He read them rapidly. Then he handed the birth certificate to me. I examined it. The name was Reginald Henry Ashcombe, born in 1865. I looked at the death certificate. Same name, died in 1887. Then Holmes handed me the second birth certificate. The name was Edmund Charles Ashcombe, born in 1867. I looked at Holmes. Edmund? He nodded. Sir Reginald's younger brother. But where is he? Holmes pointed toward the unconscious man. Here. I stared at Sir Reginald. Then he has been impersonating his brother. Precisely. Lestrade looked furious. Why? Holmes opened the letter. Because the original Reginald was not the heir. What? Holmes handed the letter to Lestrade. The inspector read it. His face became increasingly grave. What does it say? Holmes answered. It says that Reginald was removed from the succession because he discovered the railway conspiracy. Eleanor covered her mouth. No, Holmes continued. He was sent away under an assumed identity. By whom? His father. And Edmund took his place? Yes. Why would he agree? Holmes looked at the unconscious man. Because he was promised the estate. Lestrade stared. Then Edmund is the impostor. Not entirely. What do you mean? Holmes folded the letter. Edmund became Sir Reginald because the family needed someone to carry the title. But who killed Professor Vale? Holmes did not answer. Holmes? He looked toward the door. I believe we have been asking the wrong question. What question should we ask? Who benefited from Professor Vale's death? Edmund, perhaps, and from the death of the signalman, perhaps. Then why would Edmund leave himself exposed? Holmes smiled. Because he did not. The fear. Realization came slowly. You mean someone else is using Edmund? Exactly. Who? Holmes glanced at Eleanor. She looked terrified. Not Eleanor, I said. No. Holmes walked to the table. There is another player. He unfolded the photograph again. Look carefully. I studied it. The three men stood beside the railway platform. Professor Vale, Sir Reginald, Samuel Rook. But Holmes pointed toward the far edge. There. At first I saw nothing. Then, in the dark reflection of the railway carriage window, there appeared to be a fourth figure. A man standing several yards away. His face was indistinct. Who is that? I asked. Holmes shook his head. I do not know. Eleanor approached. She stared at the photograph. Then suddenly she stepped backward. I know him. Holmes turned. Who? Her voice trembled. My father's secretary. Name? Arthur Bell. Holmes's expression changed. Bell, yes. Was he employed by the Ashcombs in 1878? Yes. Is he alive? Eleanor shook her head. He died in 1890. Holmes looked at Lestrade. Another dead man. Lestrade stared at him. You cannot be suggesting. I am suggesting nothing. Holmes examined the photograph again. But the pattern is becoming difficult to ignore. At that moment Sir Reginald groaned. We all turned. His eyes opened. He looked at Holmes. Where am I? Rothwick Manor. His face filled with terror. No. Who attacked you? He looked toward Eleanor, then toward Lestrade. Finally, his eyes settled upon Holmes. You must leave. Why? Because he knows you are here. Who? Sir Reginald struggled to speak. The man behind the house. Holmes moved closer. What man? The one who wears my face. I felt a chill. You mean Edmund? Sir Reginald shook his head. No. His voice weakened. Edmund is dead. Holmes became very still. Dead? 3 years. Then who is the man impersonating him? Sir Reginald looked directly at Holmes. The same man who impersonated my father. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Arthur Bell? Sir Reginald stared at him. Then he whispered, You know his name. A loud crash came from downstairs. Eleanor screamed. Holmes drew his revolver. Lestrade followed. We rushed into the corridor. Below us, the great hall was filled with smoke. A figure stood beside the front door. Tall, thin, dressed in black. He looked upward. For one brief instant, the light from the chandelier illuminated his face. It was the face of Sir Reginald Ashcombe. Then he smiled. Holmes raised his revolver. Stop. The figure turned and disappeared through the door. Lestrade raced downstairs. Holmes stopped him. Do not follow. Why? Because the house is the trap. What? Holmes looked at the smoke rising from the hall. The real trap is beneath us. A deep metallic sound echoed through the floor. Then another. The house itself seemed to tremble. Holmes's face became grim. Watson, take Sir Reginald and Miss Ashcombe upstairs. And you? I am going below. Alone? He smiled. No. From the darkness behind us came a familiar voice. Neither am I. We turned. Thomas Rook stood at the end of the corridor, but he was holding a revolver, and it was pointed directly at Holmes. For one terrible instant I believed that Thomas Rook had betrayed us. The old signalman's hand was steady, his revolver level, and his pale eyes fixed upon Holmes with an intensity which I had never before observed in him. Behind him, the smoke from the hall curled slowly through the gallery, giving the ancient portraits an almost spectral appearance. Lestrade raised his own weapon. "Drop it, Rook." The old man did not move. Holmes, however, remained perfectly calm. "Watson," said he quietly, "do not move. I had no intention, I was not speaking to you." His eyes remained upon Rook. "You have made a curious mistake, my friend." Rook's expression hardened. "What mistake?" "You are holding the revolver in your left hand." The old man glanced down. Holmes continued. "You told me this afternoon that you had worked the railway for more than 30 years. A signalman accustomed to manipulating levers, lamps, and mechanical controls would naturally favor his dominant hand. Yet the calluses upon your right palm are considerably heavier than those upon your left." Rook's face remained expressionless. "You have been examining my hands?" "I examine everything. Then you should know better than to challenge me." Holmes smiled. "Quite the contrary. I now know that you are not Thomas Rook." The man raised the revolver. Lestrade stepped forward. "Holmes." But the supposed Rook fired. The bullet struck the wall beside Holmes's head. In the same instant, Holmes threw himself sideways. Lestrade fired twice, and the stranger disappeared through a doorway. "After him," cried Lestrade. Holmes was already moving. We raced along the gallery, past the portraits and darkened rooms, until the corridor ended at a narrow staircase. The stranger had vanished. Holmes stopped. "No. What is it?" I asked. He looked at the floor. "There are no footprints. That is impossible." "Not impossible." He pointed toward the carpet. "Look." A section of the carpet had been lifted. Beneath it was a narrow opening. A hidden passage. Holmes pulled it aside. Cold air rose from below. "Watson, you remember the tunnel?" "Yes. This house is built over it." Lestrade crouched beside the opening. "Then he escaped underground." "No." Holmes pointed to the dust. "No one has entered this passage tonight." "Then where did he go?" Holmes looked toward the opposite wall. "There." A portrait hung above the fireplace. He removed it. Behind it was another door. This one stood open. Lestrade stared. "Another passage." Holmes nodded. Rothwick Manor was designed to contain secrets. We entered. The passage descended sharply beneath the house. Unlike the railway tunnel, this one was narrow and beautifully constructed, its walls lined with dark oak panels. Several doors opened from it, each bearing an old brass number. 1, 2, 3. Holmes stopped at the fourth. 4. "What about it?" I asked. He touched the handle. Nothing. He opened the door. Inside was a small room containing a desk, several ledgers, and a collection of photographs. Holmes immediately began examining them. "Watson." "Yes." "Look at these." The photographs showed the Ashcombe family across several decades. Sir Reginald, his father, his grandfather. And then, repeatedly, the same face. A thin man with dark hair and sharp eyes. Arthur Bell. Yet beneath several photographs, different names had been written. Arthur Bell, Edmund Ashcombe, Samuel Rook, Charles Bellamy. I stared in disbelief. These are different men. No. Holmes placed the photographs beside one another. The same man. Lestrade's face became pale. "You mean he has been impersonating all of them?" "Not merely impersonating." Holmes picked up a ledger. "He has been creating identities." I turned the pages. Each identity had been supported by documents, signatures, financial records, and witnesses. Then Professor Vale discovered this. "Yes, and that is why he had to die." Holmes nodded. Vale discovered that one man had been appearing under several names for decades. Arthur Bell, perhaps. Holmes turned another page. Then he stopped. His expression changed. "What?" He showed me the ledger. There was an entry dated 1890. A.B. transferred to London. Beneath it was another entry. A.B. assumed identity of Reginald Ashcombe. Lestrade stared. But if Arthur Bell became Sir Reginald, who was the man we found upstairs? Edmund. Then Edmund was alive. Until recently. Holmes looked toward the passage. Or until someone wanted us to believe he was. A sound came from behind us. The door slammed shut. We rushed toward it. Locked. Lestrade struck it with his shoulder. Nothing. Holmes examined the lock. "Mechanical. Can you open it?" "Yes." "How long?" 30 seconds. A faint ticking began. Holmes stopped. Too late. What? He looked upward. Gas. A thin hiss had begun from a vent in the ceiling. I immediately covered my mouth. Holmes moved to the wall. Watson, find the valve. I searched desperately. There. A brass wheel was mounted beneath the desk. I turned it. The hiss stopped. Lestrade breathed heavily. That was close. Holmes nodded. Very. He examined the mechanism. The gas was not intended to kill us. Then what? To delay us. Why? Because someone is approaching the house. Who? Holmes looked at the ledger. The police. I stared. How could the police be coming? He pointed to the window. A distant glow appeared through the trees. Lanterns. Then another. Several carriages were approaching Rothwick Manor. Lestrade looked confused. I did not send for them. Neither did I. Holmes closed the ledger. Then someone else has. The great hall below suddenly erupted with shouting. Doors slammed. Boots struck the floor. Men were entering the house. Lestrade drew his revolver. Perhaps they are here to arrest us. Holmes smiled. Perhaps? A voice came from the passage. Inspector Lestrade. It was the voice of a Scotland Yard officer. Lestrade relaxed. That is Inspector Bradshaw. Holmes immediately raised a hand. Do not answer. Why? Because Bradshaw has been dead for 2 years. Lestrade stared at him. The voice came again. Inspector Lestrade, we have orders to secure the house. Holmes looked at me. Watson, this is the point at which most men become frightened. I confess I am approaching that stage. Excellent. Fear improves observation. The footsteps came closer. Holmes moved toward the door. Then he whispered, when they enter, do not look at their faces. Why? Look at their hands. The door opened. 3 men in police uniforms entered. Their weapons were drawn. Inspector Lestrade, said the first, step away from Mr. Holmes. Lestrade stared at them. You know my name. Of course. Holmes examined their hands. Then he smiled. You are not police officers. The first man raised his weapon. Holmes moved instantly. He kicked the man's wrist. The revolver flew across the room. Lestrade attacked the second. I seized a chair and struck the third across the shoulder. Within moments the room was filled with shouting and struggling men. The first attacker fled through the passage. The second collapsed beneath Lestrade. The third attempted to escape through the window. Holmes caught him by the coat. Who sent you? The man refused to answer. Holmes examined his collar. There was a small embroidered symbol. A number, 17. Who is your employer? The man remained silent. Holmes reached into his pocket and removed the brass token. He held it before the man's face. The prisoner's expression changed. Holmes saw it. So you know what this means? No. You do. No. Holmes leaned closer. Then perhaps you will explain why the same symbol is stitched into your coat. The man suddenly laughed. You think you have won. Holmes' expression remained calm. No. Then why are you smiling? Because you have confirmed something. What? That the number 17 does not belong to the railway. The man stopped laughing. Holmes continued. It belongs to an organization. The prisoner looked frightened. Who leads it? No answer. Arthur Bell? The man's face went completely white. Holmes nodded. Thank you. The man lunged for his revolver. Lestrade struck him down. Enough. We bound the prisoner and returned to the upper chamber. Eleanor was beside Sir Reginald. Thomas Rook stood near the window. Holmes approached him. You are not Thomas Rook. The old man shook his head. No. Who are you? Samuel Rook. I stared, but Samuel was the man we saw in the underground train. That was not Samuel. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then who was he? Rook looked toward the unconscious Sir Reginald. Arthur Bell. The room fell silent. Holmes's face showed no surprise. So the man we believed was Samuel was actually Bell. Yes, and you. I am the real Samuel Rook. Why did you hide your identity? Because Arthur Bell has hunted me for 15 years. Holmes turned toward the unconscious man. And Professor Vale. He discovered Bell's true identity. Why didn't you tell us sooner? I needed to know whether you were working for him. Holmes smiled. You could have asked. I did. When? The first night. I frowned. I do not understand. Rook looked at Holmes. When I gave you the photograph, I watched what you did with it. Holmes nodded. You wanted to see whether I recognized Bell. Yes, and when I did, I knew you were trustworthy. Holmes walked to the window. Then tell me the truth. Samuel Rook took a deep breath. Arthur Bell has been operating under false identities for years. He controls the railway network through bribery and murder. But he is not the highest authority. Who is? Rook hesitated. The Ashcombe family. Holmes looked at him. Which Ashcombe? The one who ordered the original conspiracy. Dead? Yes. Then who continues it? Samuel Rook pointed toward Sir Reginald, his son. Holmes stared. Edmund? No. Then who? Rook whispered. The real Reginald Ashcombe. I felt a chill. But Sir Reginald is here. Yes. Then how can another Reginald exist? Rook's face became grim. Because the man in this room is not Edmund. Holmes turned sharply. Then who is he? Samuel Rook looked at the unconscious man. He is the original Reginald Ashcombe. The words seemed impossible. The man believed dead since 1887? Yes. Then who was Edmund? Edmund died in 1890. Holmes's expression changed. And Arthur Bell assumed his identity? Yes. Then who was impersonating Reginald? Samuel Rook looked toward the portrait gallery. Arthur Bell, but the man upstairs is the real Reginald. Yes. Holmes stared at him. Then why did Bell attack him? Because Reginald knows where the bodies are buried. What bodies? Rook's face became grim. Every witness who ever discovered the truth. A sudden movement came from the bed. Sir Reginald opened his eyes. He looked at Holmes. Do not trust him. Holmes turned. Whom? Sir Reginald's trembling hand rose. He pointed at Samuel Rook. He is lying. Samuel Rook stepped backward. No. Sir Reginald struggled to sit. Samuel Rook died in 1889. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then who are you? The old man stared at him. I am the man who killed him. A silence followed. Then Holmes smiled. Not with amusement, with recognition. Of course. Lestrade looked at him. What? Holmes turned toward the window. The fourth man. I felt the pieces fall together. The man in the old photograph. Holmes nodded. The man whose face was hidden in the reflection. Sir Reginald stared at him. Arthur Bell. Holmes shook his head. No. He pointed toward the old man. Not Bell. Then he looked at the unconscious man. Not Reginald. His eyes moved to Eleanor. Not Edmund. Finally, Holmes turned toward me. Watson, we have spent this entire investigation searching for one man, and, Holmes's voice was almost a whisper, we should have been searching for two. At that precise moment, the door to the tower opened. A man stood there, tall, thin, dressed in black. His face was unmistakable. It was the face of Professor Adrian Vale, but the professor was dead, and the man was smiling. For several seconds none of us moved. The man standing in the doorway possessed the unmistakable features of Professor Adrian Vale, and yet I had myself examined the professor's body after the tragedy aboard the Express. I had seen the pallor of death upon his face, had felt the coldness of his hand, and had watched the railway officials carry his remains from the compartment, and yet there he stood, alive, smiling. Holmes was the first to break the silence. Professor Vale. The stranger inclined his head. Mr. Holmes? Lestrade raised his revolver. Don't move. The man laughed softly. You are rather late, Inspector. Holmes stepped forward. No, Professor. We are precisely on time. The man's smile faded. Holmes continued. You made one error. What error? You assumed that because we discovered your body, we would accept your death. The man glanced toward me. Dr. Watson. I felt a chill. How do you know me? Professor Vale knew you. No, said Holmes. Professor Vale knew very little about you. The man looked back at him. You are confident. I am certain. Holmes moved closer. You are not Professor Adrian Vale. The man's expression hardened. Then who am I? Holmes smiled. Arthur Bell. At the name, Samuel Rook stepped backward. Eleanor gasped. Sir Reginald struggled to rise. The man in the doorway laughed. Very good. Lestrade stared at Holmes. You knew. I suspected. When? On the train. The train? Yes. Holmes pointed toward the phonograph. The voice we heard was Vale's. The body we found was dressed as Vale, but the hands were wrong. I stared at him. The hands? Professor Vale had a small scar across his left thumb from a laboratory accident. The corpse had no such scar. But why didn't you tell me? Because the murderer expected me to discover it. Holmes turned toward the false professor. And that was your second mistake. The impostor slowly closed the door behind him. You have been troublesome, Holmes. I have been described in worse terms. You believe you have solved everything. No. Holmes's eyes became cold. I believe you are about to explain the remaining part. The impostor smiled. You always were arrogant, and you always were careless. The man stepped forward. My name is Arthur Bell. Samuel Rook gave a bitter laugh. I knew it. Bell looked at him. You should have remained in Canada. I returned for Vale. No, you returned for revenge. Samuel's hand tightened around his revolver. Holmes raised his own. Gentlemen. Both men looked at him. Before either of you commits another murder, perhaps we can finish the history. Bell laughed. You want history? Yes. Then listen carefully. He walked toward the fireplace. The Ashcombe Railway network began 40 years ago. Sir Malcolm Ashcombe discovered that private tunnels could move more than coal. They could move information. Holmes nodded. Documents, people, money, witnesses. Bell smiled. Exactly, he continued. When the government began investigating railway corruption, the Ashcombes created a private organization. The number 17 became its symbol. The 17th room? I asked. Bell looked at me. The 17th passenger. What does that mean? Every operation required one person who knew too much. Holmes answered. The witness. Bell nodded. That witness was transported secretly, sometimes bribed. Sometimes threatened, and sometimes killed, said Lestrade. Yes, Professor Vale discovered this. He discovered the records, and attempted to expose you. Bell's smile disappeared. He was going to destroy everything. So you murdered him? No. Holmes looked surprised. Bell continued. Vale was not murdered. Silence filled the room. What? I exclaimed. Bell smiled again. The man who died aboard the Express was Samuel Rook's assistant. Samuel stared at him. You killed him. I used him. Holmes nodded slowly. A substitute body. Yes. Then where was Vale? Bell looked toward the unconscious Sir Reginald. He was here. Sir Reginald opened his eyes. I never saw him. You did. Bell smiled. You saw him 3 nights ago. Sir Reginald stared. The masked physician. Holmes turned sharply. The doctor who treated your wound. Sir Reginald nodded weakly. He called himself Dr. Marsh. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Bell. Correct. Holmes's face became grim. So you had access to him from the beginning? Yes. And Professor Vale? Bell looked toward the door. Below. Holmes immediately turned. The underground chambers. Bell smiled. You are quick. Holmes looked at Lestrade. Take 2 men and search the lower tunnel. Lestrade hesitated. We have no men. Then go yourself. Lestrade left. Bell did not stop him. That troubled me. Holmes, I whispered, why is he allowing us to search? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he looked at the clock. It was 11:40. The minute hand moved slowly. Bell noticed Holmes watching it. You remember the schedule? Yes, midnight. What happens then? Bell smiled. The final train leaves. Where? London. Holmes's expression changed. And who is aboard? Bell said nothing. Holmes stepped closer. Edward Bellamy. Bell's smile returned. Yes. Holmes turned to Samuel Rook. Who is Edward Bellamy? Samuel looked down. The last surviving witness. To what? To the original murder. Holmes became still. What murder? Samuel swallowed. Sir Malcolm Ashcombe was not the founder of the railway conspiracy. Who was? His son. Which son? Samuel looked toward the portrait. Reginald. I looked at the unconscious man. The man in this room? No. Samuel shook his head. The original Reginald was murdered in 1887. Holmes stared at Bell. You killed him. Bell said nothing. You then assumed his identity. Yes. And Edmund was useful until he became inconvenient. Holmes nodded. Professor Vale discovered the murder. Yes. And Edward Bellamy witnessed it. Bell's eyes hardened. Unfortunately. Holmes looked at the clock. 11:45. Then the entire railway operation exists to eliminate the last witness. Bell smiled. Not eliminate, transport. Exactly. Holmes's eyes narrowed. To where? Bell stepped toward the window. Rothwick's old quarry. I felt a chill. The abandoned quarry? Yes. And the train? It will arrive there at 12:10. Holmes looked at him. You have told us everything. Not quite. Bell reached into his coat. Lestrade suddenly returned. Holmes. He was alone. Where is Vale? In the lower chamber. Alive? Lestrade's face was grim. Yes. Holmes turned toward Bell. Then why? Bell smiled. Because you are about to make your final journey. The lights went out. A gunshot rang through the darkness. Someone shouted. I heard footsteps. Then Holmes's voice. Watson, I am here. Do not move. A second shot struck the ceiling. The lamps came back. Bell was gone. Samuel Rook lay unconscious beside the table. Eleanor was holding Sir Reginald upright. Holmes stood near the window. What happened? Bell escaped. Through the window? No. Holmes pointed to the floor. A section of the carpet had been removed. Another passage. We descended immediately. The hidden tunnel ran beneath the manor and eventually opened into the old railway chamber. There, beneath a single lamp, sat Professor Adrian Vale, alive, but terribly weakened. He looked at Holmes. You came. Holmes knelt beside him. Professor. Vale smiled faintly. I knew you would. Who imprisoned you? Bell. Why didn't he kill you? Because he needed my knowledge. What knowledge? Vale looked at me. The identities. Holmes leaned closer. Explain. Vale took a breath. Bell had been using false identities for years, but he could not create them alone. I discovered that he had an accomplice inside the government. Who? Vale looked toward Holmes. Sir Reginald. Holmes glanced toward the tunnel entrance. The man upstairs? Yes, but he is a victim. Vale shook his head. No. Holmes became still. He was never kidnapped. What? He arranged everything. The truth struck me with extraordinary force. The wounded man upstairs had been playing the victim. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment. Of course, Vale continued. The man called Reginald Ashcombe was the architect. Bell was his instrument. And Edmund? Dead. Samuel? Alive. And you? A witness. Holmes rose. Then the final train is not carrying Edward Bellamy. Vale looked at him. No. Holmes's expression hardened. It is carrying us. At that moment a whistle echoed through the tunnel. The underground train was moving. Holmes checked his watch. Midnight. Watson. Yes? Bring Professor Vale. To where? The train. We hurried toward the platform. The train waited beneath the manor, its lamps burning brightly. But there was no driver. Holmes entered the first carriage. On the seats lay several envelopes. Each bore a name. Inspector Lestrade, Dr. John Watson, Sherlock Holmes, and one final envelope, the last passenger. Holmes picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He read it. Then he smiled. What does it say? I asked. It says our enemy has made his final mistake. The train began moving. I looked through the window. At the end of the platform stood a man, Sir Reginald. He was watching us. But beside him stood another figure, Arthur Bell, and between them was Eleanor. Her hands were bound. Holmes pulled the emergency cord. Nothing happened. The train accelerated. Holmes, he remained calm. Do not worry. Do not worry. We are being carried into an underground tunnel by criminals. No. What? Holmes looked at the clock. This is not their train. The train suddenly emerged from the darkness into daylight. We burst through the tunnel mouth. Ahead lay the main railway line. A regular express was approaching. Holmes smiled. The real train. I understood. The underground carriage had been designed to appear connected to the private railway, but Holmes had altered the switch before we boarded. We were no longer traveling toward the quarry. We were traveling toward London, and Bell had boarded the wrong train. At the next junction, the private train came to a halt. Scotland Yard officers surrounded it. Lestrade had sent a signal through the emergency telegraph before we departed. Bell attempted to flee. He was caught beside the third carriage. Sir Reginald was arrested in the manor. Eleanor was freed, and the documents recovered from Rothwick Manor proved the existence of the entire conspiracy. But one mystery remained. Arthur Bell had never explained how he had survived so many identities. The answer came 3 days later. Holmes received a letter. It was from Professor Vale. Inside was a single photograph. The photograph showed Arthur Bell as a young man. Beside him stood another man, identical in appearance. Holmes studied it. I stared over his shoulder. Holmes? Yes. They are twins. He nodded. The original Arthur Bell had a twin brother. And the man we arrested? Holmes smiled. The wrong brother. I stared at him. You mean Bell escaped? Holmes shook his head. No. He placed the photograph beside the newspaper report. The man we arrested is Arthur Bell. Then who is the other? Holmes looked toward the window. The man who has been giving him orders. I felt a chill. The true mastermind? Yes. Who? Holmes tapped the photograph. The fourth man. I looked at the face. Then I understood. The face belonged to a man whose name had appeared repeatedly throughout the case. But he had never been considered a suspect. Edward Bellamy, the supposed witness, the last passenger. Holmes leaned back in his chair. The most elegant deception, Watson, is one in which the victim and the criminal exchange places. But Bellamy was supposed to be the final witness. Precisely. And he was actually the mastermind. Yes? Then what happened to him? Holmes smiled. He disappeared before the arrest. You knew? I suspected. Then why didn't you stop him? Because there was no evidence. And now? Holmes glanced at the photograph. Now we have a trail. I laughed. Another case? My dear Watson, there is always another case. He rose and walked toward the window. The fog of London had begun to gather over Baker Street. Holmes looked into it thoughtfully. You see, Watson, a mystery is rarely solved when the murderer is found. It is solved when we understand why the murderer believed he could never be found. And what did Bell believe? Holmes smiled. That he was the only man capable of changing identities. He picked up his violin. He forgot the most important principle of all. What principle? Holmes drew the bow across the strings. That a disguise may deceive the eye, Watson, but it cannot deceive history. And with that he turned away from the case, apparently satisfied, while I sat beside the fire and reflected upon the extraordinary journey that had begun with a mysterious voice aboard an express train and ended beneath the ancient stones of Rothwick Manor. Yet even as I closed my notebook, I could not escape one uncomfortable thought. Somewhere beyond London, a man named Edward Bellamy was still free. And if Holmes was correct, the dangerous encounter in the express train had never been the beginning of the mystery. It had merely been the first carriage of a much longer journey.